And now I would like to introduce Attorney EvanNappen1. Attorney Nappen has practiced law for more than 28 years with a concentration in firearm law matters, primarily dealing with criminal charges, domestic violence, seizure, I think there's a, excuse me. Excuse me, folks. Primarily dealing with criminal charges and domestic violence, seizure and forfeiture, firearm licensing, NIC denials, hunting and fishing charges, annulments, and rights and restoration. Attorney Nappen has law firms in both New Hampshire and New Jersey. He was one of the first attorneys to get a federal injunction against the state gun law. He has authored a number of gun rights books, including New Hampshire Gun, Knife, and Weapon Law, the New Jersey Gun Law Guide, the Declaration, and numerous articles appearing in such magazines as American Handgunner, Blue Book of Gun Values, and American Gunsmith, to name but a few. He also wrote and produced the DVDs entitled Gun Control Out of Control and How Gun Laws Make Honest Citizens Criminals. Last but hardly least, he has been TV and radio guest on Fox News, Judge Janine, and 107 The Pulse. Please welcome Attorney Nappen, who is here to reinforce the original purpose of the Second Amendment, per the framers' perspective, and to remind us how we can continue to receive Second Amendment protection by knowing all of our rights. Please help us welcome Attorney Nappen.
Dave Welch, it was wonderful. I love listening to you about the history, New Hampshire, and the Revolution. And Dave talked a little bit about the Second Amendment, so I'm going to talk a little bit about history. We'll switch a little. Because what I brought this along because I really love to share this with all of you. And these are wonderful reproductions and used for making living history. But this right here is an actual Charleville, and it's really quite an amazing firearm because this Charleville is marked NH 3B number 267. This is an actual Charleville that came on the ship, the Aphrodite. It was one of the 12,000 that made it past the British blockade to New Hampshire. And there's a really interesting story about this, and later if any of you want to examine this, you can feel free to hold the history in your hands, because these guns were incredibly significant to America gaining its freedom. In 1777, we were quite desperate for arms. Washington had actually put out an order to scour the countryside for anything that would shoot. And we were seriously considering Benjamin Franklin's suggestion to arm the colonists with bows and arrows. Even though so many folks had guns, there still wasn't enough. So Benjamin Franklin was in France. And he was working over France to get France to join with us and to help us. And he was in the King's Court. He would go into the King's Court, and that was the place to be if you were in any way wanted to be with the celebrities of the day. And the rock star celebrity of the day was a fellow named Beaumarchais. And Beaumarchais wrote a number of plays. He wrote The Barber of Seville, The Marriage of Figaro, and he was one of the King's favorites. He was, like I said, the rock star of the day. And Beaumarchais, who many of you probably have not heard of in this context, and yet it is amazing. He loved the American Revolution. He loved what America was all about and wanted to help. And he set up, with the king, a totally illegal and secret trading company under a fake Spanish name, and he got the king to release the 12,000 stands of arms from the armory that Beaumarchais made the arrangements so they could be smuggled past the British blockade and made it to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Now, when these guns arrived, they came into Portsmouth, and we don't think like this today, but when they came in, Langdon himself, Langdon said, these are New Hampshire guns. These don't belong to anybody else. They came into New Hampshire, and they're for New Hampshire. And George Washington disagreed with that. And he sent an armed contingent to seize the guns at Portsmouth. So now there was an internal squabble over who was getting these desperately needed arms. And this is how come these guns became marked. Because this is really the only known set of marked guns from the Revolution. There were Brown Besses, and there were other Charlevilles, and there were other weapons that came from Germany as well, all through the Revolution. But the only ones that are known to be actually marked for the Revolution is this very gun, this one. And the reason was they came to a deal. And the deal was that New Hampshire would get enough guns to arm every New Hampshire man, and the rest would go to Washington. And I went to the archives, the state archives, and I found the original receipt paid out to General Enoch Poor. And what it was a reimbursement for 2,016 markings. He had to pay gunsmiths to mark these muskets. And he wanted to be reimbursed for that, and the Committee of Safety, in fact, did reimburse him. And finding this document, I went to one of the top collectors in the country, who's passed away the last 2 years. He was a wonderful person. His name was George Newman. His collection's on display at Valley Forge. He wrote numerous books on arms and accoutrements of the American Revolution. He really was the expert. He verified this as authentic and all for me, but I brought him a copy of that. He had never seen that document. Even with all the research, he was thrilled. And he said, wow, now we finally know exactly how many. And it was that 2016, of which this gun was one of them. And the 3B, there was 1B, 2B, and 3B. 3B was commanded by a fellow named Scammell, who was Sullivan's law partner, and both of them participated in the raid at Fort William and Mary, as mentioned, which, by the way, was the first conflict of the American Revolution. It occurred in New Hampshire, not Massachusetts, not Lexington and Concord. That was important, but we were first. And it was Sullivan and Scammell and 400 Sons of Liberty that hit the fort there. Well, Scammell, this was from his group. He was in charge of the 3rd, and General Enoch Poor was the head of all three of them. And there was a political fallout at the time between Stark and Poor, and Poor politically happened to win out at that time. And all these 2016 and the New Hampshire men took off very quickly for Saratoga. And they fought the battle at Saratoga. And I can guarantee you this musket was there at Saratoga because they were too desperate for arms for it not to be. And of course, the battle was won at Saratoga, and the person in charge there on our side was none other than Benedict Arnold, who we don't associate with being an American hero, but he was at that very moment, and he made the difference. And by winning in Saratoga and having that victory, the French officially, after that, agreed to the French and American alliance and, in effect, went public with their support for the American Revolution. And it was because of that that in 1781, de Grasse was there with the fleet, and we were able to win at Yorktown. And that all traces back to our muskets coming to New Hampshire and being able to win the battle at Saratoga without these arms. We would not have been able to do it. And it's really a fascinating history with Benjamin Franklin working with Beaumarchais and getting these guns, and it comes right back down to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and the men who fought from New Hampshire in that revolution, and one of them holding this very gun. So, you know, it's a rich, great history that we should be extremely proud of in New Hampshire. And we really made a difference in the revolution in tremendous ways. So if anyone wants to look at this later up close, absolutely feel free, and be happy to have you take a look at it and see. It's also got what's called U.S. surcharges, marked U.S. here and U.S., and that was also done by the order of George Washington, because he didn't want arms disappearing, so they marked them so that the U.S. property would also be identified, and this is so surcharged. Okay, well, a little stroll through history there. And, you know, we hear a lot about the Second Amendment, and we all be surprised if anyone in this audience didn't believe in the right to keep and bear arms. But sometimes you'll hear folks say, what rights are we given by the Constitution? You might hear someone talk about that, and some of you probably know the answer, of course, is that we're not given any rights by the Constitution. The Constitution guarantees rights that pre-exist. It's a guarantee of existing rights. So if anyone thinks the Constitution gives us rights, please adjust your thinking. Now, the folks in Washington might like us to think that. That's not what it is. It's a guarantee, and it's a guarantee that needs to be respected. But unfortunately, it hasn't been that much respected, and it's amazing when you think about how clear the Second Amendment is, and folks in the judiciary and in Congress somehow have trouble understanding what that means, and yet the courts can divine other rights that aren't listed at all. And look, I'm not against having more rights identified. I think that's fine. But if you can extrapolate and come up with the right to privacy, for example, which I like having a right to privacy, I'm not opposed to that, but it's not in the Constitution as a guarantee. You'll never find it written there in any place. And yet, the right to privacy is there, and it's enforced with all different kinds of cases and laws, and again, all that can be quite good. But what about the Second Amendment, where it's crystal clear? Well, folks, it wasn't until a very famous decision, the Heller decision, came about, that constitutional right that we all know is so clear as to what it means was finally established. And of course, it isn't fully vetted out. There's still a lot of areas to the Second Amendment, but that was the case that did it. Now, let me just pull from here. All right. The Second Amendment to the United States Constitution says, I don't have to read it, of course I know it, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, okay, remember that comma, the other side likes to ignore that, all right? The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's the Second Amendment, straightforward, and if anyone even understands English, you understand what that comma means and how it, you know, the whole argument of the collective, that it's only for the militia, all that stuff has been thrown out the window, if not by just logic and arguments and study, but by Heller itself. Plainly, we have, as established in Heller in 2008, okay, June 26, 2008, we have an individual right to keep and bear arms. Now, what Heller involved was a challenge to the Washington, D.C. gun laws. Now, Washington, D.C. had really bad gun laws. I mean, essentially you couldn't purchase a handgun and unless you had one. I think it goes back 1974, you weren't going to be able to get one. And if you had long arms of any sort, they had to be broken apart and stored in that manner. And so Dick Heller and others brought this challenge forward, essentially through Cato and others. It wasn't through the NRA, you need to know that. It didn't start off in that way. And it was controversial to bring this case. Now, part of the problem with even establishing a mechanism for putting the challenge forward is a lot of the rights in the Constitution, they don't apply necessarily to the states until the court says they apply to the states. And what does that mean? It means the word that lawyers use is called incorporation. Until a constitutional right that's federal is incorporated to the states via the 14th Amendment, essentially, it doesn't necessarily apply to the states. So, right, in modern day we think of, hey, we have the Bill of Rights, we have the Constitution, and we think all those rights that are federal must apply to the state, but it wasn't that way. The Federal Bill of Rights was a guarantee of rights against the federal government, not against state governments. The states had their own, if they in fact did have them, their own rights and their own constitution. And so if you were going to enforce the Second Amendment prior to Heller and McDonald, which we'll get to, and you wanted to challenge a state gun law, the court would and did in many cases, and these are even lower courts, said, well look, that, even in New Jersey, Burton versus Sills, where the gun law was challenged, was a great example. Sorry, but the Second Amendment has not been incorporated to the states, they said in Burton. And fascinatingly, they said the Second Amendment doesn't apply to New Jersey. This was Burton versus Sills, went to the New Jersey Supreme Court. And it's one of the best examples of the worst type of gun control case you would ever imagine reading. New Jersey has this horrible gun law scheme that's unbelievable. And if you're following the news, you see how it affects law-abiding people and turns them into criminals. And this was challenged right out of the box back in the late 60s, early 70s. And the court said, hey, federal Second Amendment is not applied to the states, doesn't apply to New Jersey. There is no Second Amendment in New Jersey. And when the court said that, it pointed out something else, that New Jersey's state constitution does not have a right to keep and bear arms in the state constitution. So that keeping and bearing arms in New Jersey was just a privilege, flat out. But here's the little dirty secret a lot of people don't know. In the battle in Jersey to try to get Second Amendment applied, in that battle, it went all the way to New Jersey Supreme Court, who made this horrible decision. And the very well-meaning pro-gun folks in Jersey, very well-meaning, said, we need to take this to the Supreme Court, which would be the next step. And they could have filed what's called a writ of certiorari, where you ask the court to grant certiorari so that they would hear this case, which is normally how it's done. But they didn't do that. Instead, there's a very little used provision that says when you have a constitutional right, you can bring a direct appeal to the Supreme Court. They hate that. They want to control their calendar. And if you do that, you're basically guaranteed to get it shoved down your throat.
Croc TV.